To our amazing viewers at Cheating Tales Lab, welcome and thank you. Your presence makes these stories worth sharing. We'd love to hear, which part of the world are you joining us from? Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Deception. Thomas Kellerman had built his fortune from nothing. Growing up in the Rust Belt of Ohio, he'd watched his steelworker father drink himself to death after the mills closed. At 16, Thomas swore he'd never be powerless again. Through brutal determination, he'd clawed his way from community college to Harvard Business School, then founded Kellerman Holdings, a private equity firm that specialized in hostile takeovers of failing companies. By 45, Thomas owned a sprawling estate in Connecticut, commanded respect in financial circles, and had what appeared to be the perfect family. His wife, Diana, was a former art gallery owner with aristocratic features and a refined manner that complemented his rough edges. Their son, Ryan, had just turned 16, a brilliant kid who shared Thomas's analytical mind but Diana's artistic soul. Thomas's success hadn't come from being nice. In boardrooms, he was known as the Iceman, a man who showed no mercy to competitors and never forgot a slight. He'd destroyed careers over perceived betrayals and had a reputation for patience when it came to revenge. "I don't get mad," he once told a business rival. "I get even. And I never stop until the score is settled." Diana Kellerman moved through their social circle like a queen, her auburn hair always perfectly styled, her smile practiced to perfection. She'd grown up in Boston's Beacon Hill, the daughter of a federal judge and a museum curator. Her marriage to Thomas had seemed like a fairy tale, the refined socialite and the self-made titan. But appearances, as Thomas would soon learn, could be the most dangerous lies of all. Ryan was supposed to spend that fateful weekend on a school camping trip in the Adirondacks. The last text Thomas received from his son was simple: "Having a great time, Dad. Love you." 24 hours later, the camp director called. There had been an accident. Ryan had fallen from a cliff while hiking alone. His body had been recovered from the rocks below. The funeral was everything Diana had insisted it should be: elegant, tasteful, attended by Connecticut's elite. Thomas stood stoic beside the closed casket, his jaw set in granite. He'd identified Ryan's body at the morgue, though the fall had left his son nearly unrecognizable. The only way they'd been certain was the distinctive scar on Ryan's left hand from a childhood accident. As mourners offered their condolences, Thomas's phone buzzed. A text from Ryan's number. "I'm not dead. That's not me in the coffin." Thomas's blood turned to ice. His fingers trembled as he typed back, "Where are you?" "Can't say. They're listening. Don't trust Mother and Grandma. Meet me at the old warehouse tonight." The old warehouse. Thomas knew exactly where: an abandoned textile factory he'd bought years ago but never developed. Only family knew about it. That night, Thomas drove through the industrial district with his .45 loaded and ready. If someone was playing games with his grief, they'd pay dearly. The warehouse stood dark against the sky, its broken windows like dead eyes. Inside, a single light illuminated a figure in the shadows. Thomas raised his gun, then froze. It was Ryan, unmistakably his son, alive and unharmed. "Dad, I'm sorry. I had to fake my death. They were going to kill me for real." "Who? What are you talking about?" Ryan's face was pale with terror. "Mom and Grandma Helen. I found out about their plan. They've been slowly poisoning you, Dad. For months. I have proof." The words hit Thomas like physical blows. "That's impossible. Your coffee every morning. Mom makes it special, right? Just for you." Ryan pulled out a small vial. "I tested it. Thallium sulfate. Rat poison. In small doses, it causes hair loss, fatigue, confusion. You've been showing symptoms for weeks." Thomas thought of his recent doctor visits, the unexplained exhaustion, the thinning hair Diana had blamed on stress. "Why?" "Your will, Dad. I overheard them talking. Mom inherits everything if you die naturally. But if I'm dead too, Grandma Helen becomes executor until Mom remarries. They've got it all planned out. The body in the coffin. A homeless kid who OD'd. Mom has connections at the morgue through her charity work. They made him look like he fell, planted my wallet and ring." Ryan's voice cracked. "Dad, they were going to make it look like you committed suicide from grief. Within 6 months, they'd have everything." Thomas felt his world reshaping around him. Diana, his wife of 18 years. Helen Ashworth, Diana's mother, who'd welcomed him into their Brahmin family with what he'd thought was genuine warmth. They'd played the long game, waiting until Ryan was old enough to inherit, then eliminating both father and son to claim everything. How did you find out? I came home early from a friend's house last month. Heard them in the kitchen, talking about timelines and dosages. I started recording their conversations after that. Ryan held up his phone. I've got everything, Dad. But they caught me listening at the door 3 days ago. That's when I knew I had to disappear. Thomas holstered his weapon and pulled his son into a fierce embrace. For a moment, he was just a father grateful his child was alive. Then the ice returned to his veins. They want to play games with the Kellerman family, he said quietly. They have no idea what they've unleashed. Chapter 2. The Spider's Web. Thomas spent the next week in careful preparation. To the outside world, he was a grieving father struggling with loss. He let Diana comfort him, accepted her special coffee with grateful smiles, even as his skin crawled knowing what was in it. He'd switched cups when she wasn't looking, pouring the poisoned brew into plants that quickly began to wither. Ryan remained hidden in a safe house Thomas owned under a shell company. His son had done more than just survive. He'd been busy. The boy had inherited Thomas's strategic mind and had spent his time in hiding gathering intelligence. Mom's been meeting someone, Ryan reported during their secret rendezvous. A man named Caleb Morrison. He's been coming to the house when you're at work. Thomas ran the name through his private investigator networks. Caleb Morrison, 38, Diana's former business partner from her gallery days. More importantly, her former lover from before she'd married Thomas. They'd had an affair that lasted 3 years, ending only when Thomas had entered the picture with his millions. They're not just after your money, Dad, Ryan continued. They want their old life back. Morrison's been broke since his art business failed. He needs capital to start over, and Mom never got over him. The pieces fell into place. Diana hadn't just married Thomas for security. She'd married him as a bank account for her and Morrison's future. The slow poisoning wasn't just murder. It was the final step in an 18-year con. Thomas began laying his trap. First, he visited his attorney and made subtle changes to his will, creating ironclad protections that would prevent Diana from inheriting if there was any suspicion of foul play. He also set up a trust for Ryan that couldn't be touched by anyone else. Next, he installed hidden cameras throughout the house. Within days, he had footage of Diana and Morrison together. Intimate moments that would destroy her reputation in divorce court, but more importantly for Thomas's purposes, detailed conversations about their plans. The old fool is getting weaker, Diana purred as Morrison's hands roamed her body in Thomas's marital bed. Another month and his heart should give out. The doctor will blame it on stress from Ryan's death. And if he doesn't die naturally? Morrison asked. Then we help him along. A man grieving his son, drinking too much, taking too many pills. Accidents happen. Thomas watched the footage with ice in his veins. They'd not only betrayed him, they'd orchestrated his son's fake death as psychological torture to weaken him further. Diana's tears at the funeral, her gentle comfort in his grief, it had all been performance art. But Thomas wasn't done gathering intelligence. Through his security contacts, he learned that Helen Ashworth had her own dark secrets. The respected judge's widow had been embezzling from various charities for years, using her social position to cover her tracks. Worse, she'd been helping Diana doctor financial records to hide assets from Thomas's prenuptial agreement. They think they're playing chess, Thomas told Ryan during another midnight meeting. But they don't realize they're actually pieces on my board. Thomas's plan began to take shape. It wouldn't be enough to simply expose them or send them to prison. They'd tried to destroy his family, had put his son through the trauma of faking his own death, had violated the sanctity of his home and marriage. The punishment needed to fit the crime's brutality. He reached out to contacts from his less legitimate business dealings, men who owed him favors from the early days when Kellerman Holdings had done business in gray areas. Thomas had always been careful to keep his hands clean in recent years, but he still had connections to people who weren't bound by such constraints. I need something that looks accidental but isn't, he told Viktor Petrov, a Russian businessman whose shipping company Thomas had saved from bankruptcy years earlier. 2 people, separately. Different methods. Complete discretion. Viktor smiled coldly. For you, Thomas, anything. But why not handle this personally? You have the skills. Thomas considered it. He'd learned to be ruthless in business, but this was different. This was family. This was personal. Maybe it was time to get his hands dirty. Perhaps you're right, Thomas said. But I'll need resources. Clean weapons, untraceable vehicles, disposal methods. Consider it done. When do you want to move? Soon. But first, I want them to suffer the way they made my son suffer. I want them to feel helpless, to know what's coming and be unable to stop it. Chapter 3. The Gathering Storm. Thomas's opportunity came when Diana announced she was taking a spa weekend in the Berkshires with her mother. I need time to process my grief, she said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Losing Ryan has been so hard on both of us. What she didn't know was that Thomas had been tracking their communications. The spa weekend was cover for a romantic getaway with Morrison at a secluded cabin he'd rented. Helen would be staying in town, meeting with a lawyer to finalize the probate paperwork that would transfer Ryan's inheritance to Diana's control. Thomas made his move on Friday night. He appeared at Helen's Beacon Hill townhouse unannounced, carrying a bottle of expensive wine and wearing the mask of a grieving son-in-law. Thomas, dear, what a surprise, Helen said, her practiced smile not quite reaching her eyes. Diana isn't here, you know. I came to see you, Helen. I've been thinking about family, about how precious it is, about trust. They sat in her elegant living room, surrounded by antiques and family portraits. Helen poured the wine, ironic, given that she'd been poisoning him for months. You know, Helen, I've always admired your intelligence. Diana gets it from you, I think. The ability to plan ahead, to see the long game. Helen's eyes flickered with something. Was it suspicion? You're very kind, Thomas. For instance, I imagine it takes real intelligence to slowly poison someone over months. To make it look natural. To coordinate with accomplices. Thomas sipped his wine calmly. Tell me, was the thallium your idea, or Diana's? Helen's face went ashen. The wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. I don't know what you're talking about. Thomas pulled out his phone and played one of the recorded conversations. Helen's voice came through clearly. Make sure you vary the dosage. Too much consistency, and the doctors might get suspicious. The wonderful thing about modern technology, Thomas said conversationally, is how easy it is to record things. I have hours of footage, Helen. You and Diana planning my murder. You doctoring charity books. Diana with her lover in my bed. Helen tried to stand, but Thomas was faster. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist with crushing force. Sit down, Helen. We're going to have a long conversation about consequences. For the next hour, Thomas systematically destroyed Helen's world. He showed her bank records he'd obtained, proving her embezzlement. He played recordings of her discussing the murder plot. He explained, in careful detail, how he was going to ensure she spent her remaining years in federal prison. Unless, he said finally, you do exactly what I tell you. Helen was sobbing now, all her aristocratic composure gone. What do you want? First, you're going to call Diana and tell her there's been a complication. That I'm asking questions about Ryan's death. Tell her to come home immediately and bring Morrison with her. Thomas, please. Second, you're going to transfer every asset you control to accounts I'll specify. Consider it reparations for trying to murder me. The charities will notice. The charities will never know if you cooperate. If you don't, I'll make sure the FBI knows about every penny you've stolen. At your age, Helen, federal prison is a death sentence. Helen's hands shook as she made the call to Diana. Thomas listened to every word, ensuring she followed his script exactly. There's more. Thomas continued after she hung up. You're going to help me set a trap for your daughter and her lover. Think of it as your last chance to protect Diana from the full consequences of her choices. What kind of trap? Thomas smiled, and for the first time, Helen saw the predator that had built an empire from nothing. The kind that ensures they disappear permanently, just like they tried to make me disappear. The next morning, Diana and Morrison rushed back from their romantic getaway, panicked by Helen's urgent call. They found Thomas waiting in his study, ostensibly drowning his sorrows in whiskey. Darling, Mother said you were asking questions about Ryan? Diana's voice was perfectly calibrated, concerned but not guilty. I've been thinking. Thomas slurred his words slightly. Some things don't add up about the accident. Maybe I should hire a private investigator. He watched Morrison and Diana exchange a quick glance. Good. They were scared. Thomas, grief can make us imagine things, Morrison said smoothly. Sometimes we look for complicated explanations when the truth is simply tragic. You're probably right, Caleb. By the way, I don't think we've been properly introduced. Diana's mentioned you're an old friend from the art world. Another glance between them. They were wondering how much he knew. I was thinking, Thomas continued, maybe you could help me understand something. Diana's been making me special coffee every morning since Ryan died. Says it helps with grief. But lately, I've been feeling worse instead of better. The silence in the room was deafening. Thomas let it stretch, watching them realize he was circling closer to the truth. Maybe I should have it tested. Make sure there's nothing wrong with the coffee beans. Diana's face went pale. Thomas, you're scaring me. What are you suggesting? Thomas stood up, and suddenly he wasn't drunk anymore. His movements were precise, dangerous. I'm suggesting that my wife and her lover have been slowly poisoning me while planning to steal everything I've built. Morrison moved toward the door, but Viktor Petrov's men were already there, having entered through the back of the house. Thomas had learned long ago that when you corner dangerous animals, you need overwhelming force. Sit down, both of you, Thomas said quietly. We need to discuss the price of betrayal. Chapter 4, The Art of Suffering. Thomas had learned patience during his rise from poverty to power. Now, with Diana and Morrison captive in his study, he demonstrated just how thoroughly that patience could be weaponized. Before we discuss consequences, Thomas said, pouring himself a genuine drink, I want you to understand the scope of your failure. He activated the wall-mounted television, displaying bank records, recorded conversations, and surveillance footage. Diana watched in horror as months of careful planning unraveled before her eyes. 18 years, Thomas continued conversationally. 18 years of marriage, and it was all a lie. You never loved me, Diana. I was just a stepping stone back to him. He gestured toward Morrison, who was sweating despite the room's chill. Thomas, please let me explain. Explain what? How you convinced me Ryan was dead. How you put my son through the trauma of faking his own death. How you planned to drive me to suicide with grief. Thomas's voice remained calm, but Diana had lived with him long enough to recognize the deadly quiet that preceded his most ruthless business decisions. Here's what's going to happen, Thomas continued. You're both going to experience exactly what you put my family through. The fear, the helplessness, the certainty that everything you care about is being destroyed. He nodded to Viktor's men, who efficiently searched both captives for phones and weapons. Morrison tried to resist and earned a broken nose for his trouble. Diana, your mother is currently transferring her assets to cover her embezzlement. By morning, the Ashworth family fortune will be gone, donated to the very charities she's been stealing from. Poetic justice, don't you think? Diana's composure finally cracked. You bastard. That money has been in my family for generations. And now it's helping people instead of funding murder plots. As for you, Caleb, Thomas turned to Morrison. I've had some friends in the art world spread interesting rumors about your business practices. Something about selling forgeries to elderly collectors. Your reputation is finished. Morrison's face went gray. Those are lies. Does it matter? In your world, reputation is everything. By next week, no one will take your calls. Thomas was just getting started. Over the next several hours, he systematically dismantled every aspect of their lives. Diana's social standing evaporated as evidence of her affairs circulated among Connecticut's elite. Morrison's business contacts received detailed reports of his participation in insurance fraud. Their bank accounts were frozen pending investigation of suspicious activities. You see, Thomas explained as they watched their worlds burn, I learned something important building my empire. Destruction is an art form. Anyone can kill someone in anger. But to truly defeat your enemies, you must first take away everything that gives their life meaning. As the sun set, Thomas moved to the next phase. Viktor's men escorted Diana and Morrison to separate vehicles. They were driven to different locations, abandoned properties Thomas owned through shell companies, places where screams wouldn't be heard. Diana found herself in the basement of a defunct factory, chained to a pipe in a room that reeked of rust and despair. Morrison was taken to an old warehouse, secured in a soundproof storage room. Both locations were equipped with cameras, allowing Thomas to observe their psychological deterioration. I want them to understand helplessness, Thomas told Viktor. Keep them alive, but make sure they know death would be a mercy. For the next week, Thomas followed his normal routine during the day, attending business meetings, maintaining his public facade as a grieving father. But each evening, he visited his captives to document their degradation. Diana, once pristine and controlled, became a broken woman who begged for water and pleaded for mercy. Morrison, who had traded on his charm and sophistication, was reduced to sobbing promises of restitution. Thomas recorded every moment, building a comprehensive record of their suffering. "Please," Diana whispered during one visit, her voice hoarse from screaming. "I'll do anything. I'll confess everything. Just let me go." "Confess to whom?" Thomas asked mildly. "The police? They think you're on a spa retreat with your mother." "Speaking of whom, Helen had a heart attack yesterday. The stress of losing her fortune, I imagine. She's in intensive care." The lie crushed Diana's remaining spirit. Thomas had orchestrated Helen's fate differently. The old woman was very much alive, simply imprisoned in a private facility under medical supervision. But Diana didn't need to know that yet. Morrison's breaking point came when Thomas showed him footage of Diana's confession tapes, videos where she blamed everything on Morrison's manipulation and her own weakness. "She's trying to save herself by destroying you," Thomas observed. "Even now, faced with consequences, she chooses betrayal. Some people never learn." "What do you want from us?" Morrison gasped. Thomas smiled coldly. "I want you to disappear. Completely. Just like you tried to make me disappear." Chapter 5. The Price of Betrayal. Thomas's plan for Morrison and Diana's final punishment was elegant in its brutality. He'd studied their psychological profiles during their captivity, identifying what each feared most. For Diana, it was losing her identity and social status. For Morrison, it was professional humiliation and physical pain. On a cold Tuesday morning, Thomas arranged for Morrison to be found in his apartment by police, apparently the victim of a violent robbery gone wrong. Except Morrison wasn't dead. Thomas's associates had been very careful about that. Morrison was simply changed. The attack had been precisely calculated. Severe head trauma that would leave Morrison with permanent memory loss and speech impediments. Broken bones that would heal improperly, leaving him crippled. Facial injuries that would require extensive reconstruction, ensuring he'd never again trade on his looks or charm. When Morrison woke up in the hospital, he remembered nothing of the conspiracy against Thomas. In fact, he remembered very little at all. The doctors explained to his emergency contact, a forged document naming a state-appointed guardian, that the patient would require lifelong care in a specialized facility. Thomas visited Morrison once in the rehabilitation center, disguised as a concerned friend. Morrison stared at him with vacant eyes, drool collecting at the corner of his ruined mouth. He would spend the rest of his life as a broken man, dependent on others for the most basic needs, his artistic talents and manipulative charisma erased forever. "Justice," Thomas murmured as he left the facility. Diana's fate required more subtlety. Simply killing her would be insufficient. Thomas wanted her to live with the knowledge of what she'd lost and what she'd become. Using connections in the psychiatric community, Thomas had Diana committed to a private mental health facility under an assumed identity. Her breakdown was carefully documented. The trauma of losing her son, discovering her mother's embezzlement, and finding evidence of her husband's supposed suicide had allegedly pushed her past the breaking point. The facility was comfortable but secure. Diana would never leave, but she would be well cared for, spending her days in a haze of psychiatric medications that left her docile but aware. She would remember everything, the conspiracy, the betrayal, the systematic destruction of her life, but be powerless to act on those memories. Thomas visited her once a month, always introducing himself as a concerned family friend. Diana would look at him with drugged confusion, sometimes recognizing him, but unable to articulate why that recognition filled her with terror. Helen Ashworth's punishment was more traditional, but no less complete. Thomas had orchestrated her financial ruin so thoroughly that she'd lost everything. The Beacon Hill townhouse, the family trust, even her late husband's judicial pension. The embezzlement charges Thomas had manufactured were ironclad, backed by forensic evidence his people had meticulously planted. Helen spent her final years in a federal minimum security facility, her aristocratic pretensions stripped away by orange jumpsuits and cafeteria food. She died 3 years later, alone and forgotten, another casualty of crossing Thomas Kellerman. But Thomas's most crucial task was protecting and preparing his son for the future. Ryan had been traumatized by the experience of faking his death and discovering his mother's betrayal. But Thomas recognized that trauma could be forged into strength. "What we've been through," Thomas told Ryan during one of their weekly dinners, "it's taught us something important. Trust is a luxury we can't afford. Power is the only protection." Ryan had indeed learned. At 17, he was already showing signs of his father's calculating intelligence, but with an added edge of ruthlessness born from betrayal. He would inherit not just Thomas's fortune, but his understanding that mercy was weakness and that enemies must be completely destroyed. "What about forgiveness, Dad?" Ryan asked during one conversation. "Some people say we should forgive our enemies." Thomas smiled coldly. "Forgiveness is what weak people do when they can't achieve justice. We're not weak, son. We're Kellermans. We remember every slight, and we pay back every debt." Chapter 6. The New Dynasty. 5 years after the conspiracy's exposure, Thomas Kellerman stood in his study, reviewing quarterly reports from Kellerman Holdings. The company had grown exponentially, fed by the assets stripped from his enemies and Thomas's renewed focus on expansion. Ryan, now 21, sat across from him, having just graduated summa cum laude from Wharton. The young man had inherited his father's analytical mind, but possessed a coldness that surpassed even Thomas's legendary reputation. The trauma of his mother's betrayal had burned away any capacity for sentiment or trust. "The Morrison assets have been fully liquidated," Ryan reported, his voice emotionless. "The art collection alone netted $43 million after the auction house fees." Thomas nodded approvingly. Even in his vegetative state, Morrison continued to provide value. His extensive art collection had been seized to pay for his medical care, with the surplus flowing to accounts Thomas controlled. And Diana's family properties? The Martha's Vineyard estate closes next week. The buyer is paying 20% above market value. Ryan smiled thinly. "They have no idea they're purchasing from us through the shell company." It was a final insult. Diana's childhood summer home, filled with generations of Ashworth memories, would become another Thomas Kellerman investment property. He planned to tear it down and build a modern compound, erasing even the physical traces of her family's legacy. The door to the study opened, and Viktor Petrov entered, looking every bit the legitimate businessman he'd become since Thomas had backed his expansion into legitimate shipping. Their partnership had proven mutually beneficial. Viktor provided discreet services when needed, while Thomas offered financial backing and business connections. "Thomas, I have news about our friend in the facility," Viktor said, settling into a leather chair with a crystal tumbler of vodka. "Morrison, duh? The doctors say he is declining rapidly. Infections, they think. His body is giving up." Thomas felt no satisfaction at the news, only cold completion. Morrison had served his purpose as a living reminder of the consequences of betrayal. His death would simply close another chapter. "Natural causes?" Thomas asked. Viktor shrugged. "As natural as anything else in his condition. The facility will handle arrangements. No family to claim the body." Ryan looked up from his reports. "Should we attend the funeral?" "No," Thomas said firmly. "Dead enemies deserve no acknowledgement. Besides, we have more important matters to discuss." Thomas activated a wall screen displaying architectural plans for a new Kellerman Holdings headquarters. The 50-story tower would dominate Hartford's skyline, a monument to his victory over those who'd tried to destroy him. "This will be your legacy, Ryan," Thomas said. "But more than the building, more than the money, your legacy will be the understanding that betrayal has consequences, that the Kellerman name means something." Ryan studied the plans with the same intensity Thomas brought to hostile takeovers. "The memorial garden you've included, is that for the family we've lost?" Thomas smiled at his son's choice of words. Family they'd lost, not family that had betrayed them. Diana and Helen were no longer worthy of the family designation, having forfeited that right through their treachery. "It's for the family that matters," Thomas corrected. "You, me, and the dynasty we're building. The others, they chose their fate." Over the following months, Thomas implemented the final stages of his long-term strategy. The new headquarters rose steadily, its construction funded in part by the liquidated assets of his enemies. Ryan took on increasing responsibilities within the company, showing a natural talent for the ruthless decision-making that had built their empire. Diana remained in her psychiatric facility, her mind increasingly fragmented by years of medication and isolation. During Thomas's monthly visits, she sometimes didn't recognize him at all. Other times, she would whisper apologies and pleas that fell on ears hardened by years of planning revenge. "I'm sorry," she whispered during one visit, her once beautiful face now gaunt and aged beyond her years. "I never meant for Ryan to get hurt." Thomas studied her with clinical detachment. Ryan wasn't hurt, Diana. He was educated. He learned that trust is weakness and that family loyalty must be absolute. In a way, you gave him the greatest gift possible, the knowledge that enemies were familiar faces. Diana began to cry, the tears of a broken woman who finally understood the magnitude of her losses. Thomas felt nothing, not satisfaction, not pity, not even the memory of love. She had burned away his capacity for mercy when she'd chosen betrayal over loyalty. Chapter 7. Legacy of Ice. The completion of the new Kellerman Holdings headquarters marked a milestone in Thomas's transformation from businessman to dynasty builder. The building's top floor housed a private museum dedicated to the Kellerman family history, but it was a carefully curated version that erased all traces of Diana and her family. Visitors to the museum would learn about Thomas's rise from poverty, his business innovations, and his devotion to his son. They would see no photos of Diana, no mention of his marriage, no acknowledgement that Ryan had ever had a mother. It was as if she had never existed, which Thomas considered the most complete form of revenge. Ryan, now 23 and serving as COO of Kellerman Holdings, had fully embraced his father's philosophy. He'd never married, never maintained long-term relationships, and showed no interest in starting a family. The betrayal he'd witnessed had convinced him that emotional attachments were vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. "Trust is a luxury we can't afford," Ryan often told new employees, echoing his father's words. "Loyalty must be earned and constantly proven. Betrayal is a choice that carries permanent consequences." The young Kellerman had proven even more ruthless than his father in business dealings. Where Thomas would sometimes show mercy to defeated opponents, Ryan finished them completely. He'd inherited his father's strategic mind, but coupled it with a coldness that made even Thomas occasionally uneasy. During a board meeting that spring, Thomas watched his son present a hostile takeover plan that would destroy a century-old family business. The target company's crime had been minor. They'd backed out of a deal with Kellerman Holdings, costing the company several million in projected profits. "Complete acquisition and liquidation," Ryan explained to the board members. "We strip the assets, sell off the divisions separately, and ensure the family loses everything. It sends a message about the consequences of breaking agreements with us." One board member, an old-school businessman named Theodore Walsh, raised his hand. "Isn't that somewhat excessive? The financial penalty would be sufficient too." Ryan's stare silenced the man mid-sentence. "Mr. Walsh, are you suggesting we show mercy to someone who betrayed our trust?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Thomas watched with approval as his son demonstrated the Kellerman approach to business. There could be no half measures, no incomplete victories. "I'm simply suggesting that total destruction might generate negative publicity," Walsh continued weakly. "Let me tell you about negative publicity," Ryan said, his voice carrying the same deadly quiet that Thomas used before destroying an enemy. "Negative publicity is when people think they can break deals with Kellerman Holdings without consequences, when our name becomes associated with weakness instead of strength." Thomas intervened before Ryan could completely eviscerate the board member. "What my son is explaining, gentlemen, is that reputation is built on consistency. Every time we fail to follow through on consequences, we invite future betrayals." The hostile takeover proceeded as Ryan had planned. The target company was dismantled piece by piece, its assets distributed among Kellerman subsidiaries. The founding family was left with nothing but debt and the knowledge that crossing the Kellermans had cost them everything their ancestors had built. Thomas felt pride watching his son execute the plan with surgical precision. Ryan had learned the lessons well. Never leave an enemy with the resources to strike back, and never show mercy that could be interpreted as weakness. But Thomas also recognized that his son had perhaps learned too well. Ryan's coldness was becoming absolute, his capacity for human connection nearly extinct. It was the price of their survival, But Thomas sometimes wondered if they'd save the Kellerman name only to lose their humanity in the process. The answer came during a private dinner at their estate. Ryan was reviewing acquisition targets when he mentioned Diana casually, as if discussing a piece of malfunctioning equipment. "The psychiatric facility called today," Ryan said without looking up from his reports. "They're recommending we consider moving her to a long-term care facility. Apparently, her condition has stabilized, and she no longer requires intensive psychiatric supervision." Thomas studied his son's expression, looking for any trace of emotion regarding his mother. He found none. "What would you recommend?" Thomas asked. Ryan shrugged. "From a cost perspective, the long-term facility would be more efficient. From a security perspective, she's no longer a threat regardless of her mental state. The decision is purely practical." Thomas realized that his son truly felt nothing for the woman who'd given birth to him. The betrayal had severed that connection completely, leaving Ryan free of what Thomas had always seen as potentially dangerous emotional entanglements. "We'll keep her where she is," Thomas decided. Some decisions aren't about efficiency. They're about ensuring consequences remain visible. Ryan nodded and returned to his reports, the matter already forgotten. Thomas watched his heir and felt a complex mixture of pride and sadness. He'd succeeded in creating a worthy successor, but in the process, he'd forged something that might be more weapon than man. Still, as Thomas looked around his empire, the headquarters bearing his name, the vast network of companies under his control, the fortune that would ensure Kellerman dominance for generations, he felt the satisfaction of complete victory. His enemies were destroyed, his son was prepared to carry on the legacy, and the family name commanded respect and fear in equal measure. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed them had instead made them stronger, harder, and ultimately undefeatable. Thomas Kellerman had learned the most important lesson of all: mercy was weakness, trust was dangerous, and the only family that mattered was the family that would never betray you. Chapter 8: The Final Reckoning. 7 years had passed since the conspiracy's discovery, and Thomas Kellerman had built something unprecedented: a business empire ruled by fear and absolute loyalty. The Kellerman name had become synonymous with swift, merciless retribution for any form of betrayal or opposition. Ryan, now 25, had surpassed even his father's reputation for ruthlessness. As CEO of Kellerman Holdings International Division, he'd expanded their reach into markets where traditional business ethics were considered weaknesses. Under his leadership, the company had absorbed dozens of competitors, leaving economic graveyards across 3 continents. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Thomas was reviewing acquisition reports in his corner office. Dr. Patricia Reeves from the psychiatric facility where Diana was confined sounded unusually nervous. "Mr. Kellerman, I'm calling about your wife's condition. There's been a development." Thomas set down his coffee, his attention fully focused. "What kind of development?" "She's been asking to see you. Not just the confused requests we're used to, but lucid, specific demands. She claims to have information about Ryan's death that you need to hear." Thomas felt ice form in his veins. Diana had been heavily medicated for years, her memories fragmented and unreliable. For her to suddenly become coherent and mention Ryan suggested something had changed. "When did this start?" 3 days ago. She stopped taking her medications. We're not sure how. We monitor dispensing very carefully. Without the psychiatric drugs in her system, her mental clarity has returned dramatically." Thomas understood immediately. Diana had been playing a long game of her own, pretending to be more affected by the medications than she actually was, slowly building a tolerance while planning. "What?" "I'll be there this afternoon," Thomas said, then hung up and immediately called Ryan. "We have a problem," Thomas told his son. "Your mother is lucid again, and she's asking questions about your fake death." Ryan's response was characteristically cold. "Should I handle this permanently?" The casualness with which his son suggested murdering his own mother would have shocked Thomas years ago. Now it simply confirmed that Ryan had fully embraced the Kellerman way. "Not yet. I need to understand what she knows and who she might have told." Thomas arrived at the facility that afternoon to find Diana waiting in the visitor's room. The years had aged her, but her eyes held a clarity and intelligence that had been absent during his previous visits. More disturbing, she was smiling. "Hello, Thomas. You look well. Prosperity suits you." Thomas sat across from her, studying this woman who had once shared his bed and planned his death. Dr. Reeves said you wanted to see me. I wanted to congratulate you on your victory. 7 years of planning, and you executed it perfectly. Almost perfectly. I'm not sure what you mean. Diana's smile widened. Oh, Thomas. Did you really think I spent 7 years in here just taking pills and staring at walls? I've been very busy. She reached into her sleeve and produced a small recording device, something that should have been impossible in a secured psychiatric facility. I've been documenting everything, Diana continued. Your visits, your confessions, your admissions of what you did to Caleb, to my mother, to me. 7 years of evidence. Thomas remained outwardly calm, but his mind was racing. How had she managed to record anything? How had she hidden the device from facility searches? More importantly, Diana continued, I've been in contact with the outside world. Did you know that some of the orderlies here are quite sympathetic to a woman they believe was wrongfully committed by an abusive husband? Thomas felt the first stirrings of genuine concern. What are you claiming, Diana? I'm claiming that you murdered Ryan to drive me insane, then had me committed to steal my inheritance. I'm claiming that you've been visiting me for years to gloat about your crimes. I'm claiming that you're a monster who destroyed his own family for money. The audacity of her reversal was breathtaking. Diana was repositioning herself as the victim, Thomas as the villain, and Ryan as a genuine casualty rather than a willing participant in the deception. Of course, we both know that's not true, Diana continued. Ryan is alive, hidden away somewhere while you've spent years building your empire on the lie of his death. But the beautiful thing about lies, Thomas, is that sometimes they become more powerful than the truth. Thomas realized the trap Diana had been constructing. She'd spent 7 years building a counter-narrative, gathering evidence of his visits and statements, recruiting allies among the facility staff. Even if her claims were false, they would be enough to trigger investigations that could unravel everything. What do you want? Thomas asked. I want my life back. I want Caleb's medical bills paid and his care transferred to a proper rehabilitation facility. I want my mother's charges dropped and her reputation restored. And I want half of everything you've built. And if I refuse? Diana's smile turned predatory. Then tomorrow morning, copies of these recordings go to the FBI, the State Attorney General, and every major news outlet on the East Coast. Your son's miraculous resurrection will make for fascinating headlines. Thomas studied his wife, his enemy, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine admiration for a worthy opponent. Diana had played dead for 7 years, allowing him to believe he'd won while she planned the ultimate reversal. You realize, Thomas said quietly, that if you do this, you'll destroy Ryan as well. He's been complicit in the deception. His future will be ruined. Ryan made his choice when he chose you over me, Diana replied. Let him face the consequences of his loyalty. Thomas stood to leave, his mind already working through contingencies. Diana had played her hand well, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd revealed her plan before executing it. I'll consider your terms, Thomas said. You have 24 hours, Diana called after him. After that, the truth comes out whether you cooperate or not. Thomas left the facility and immediately called Victor Petrov. Some problems required solutions that existed outside the boundaries of law and civilization. Chapter 9, Blood and Ice. Thomas returned to his estate to find Ryan waiting in the study, having already mobilized their security resources. The young man's expression was colder than Thomas had ever seen it, and that was saying something. I've been monitoring communications from the facility, Ryan reported. Mother has been in contact with at least 3 journalists and 2 FBI agents over the past month. She's been more active than we realized. Thomas poured himself a whiskey and considered their options. Diana's trap was sophisticated, but it relied on her continued existence to be effective. The recordings were damaging but not necessarily conclusive. They could be dismissed as the fantasies of a mentally ill woman if Diana wasn't alive to corroborate them. She's given us 24 hours to accept her terms, Thomas said. And after that, she destroys everything we've built and sends us both to prison. Ryan stood and walked to the window, staring out at the grounds that had been their sanctuary for 7 years. She always was intelligent. I remember that about her, even when I was young. She played chess like you play business, thinking 10 moves ahead. Thomas joined his son at the window. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that blood means nothing if it comes with betrayal, Ryan said quietly. She stopped being my mother the day she chose to poison you. Everything since then has just been cleaning up the mess." Thomas heard the finality in his son's voice and recognized it as his own philosophy taken to its logical extreme. Ryan had moved beyond cold calculation into something approaching absolute zero, a place where no human connection could survive if it conflicted with family interests. "Victor's people are already in position," Thomas said. "The facility has several blind spots in their security system. It could look like suicide, a mentally ill woman finally succumbing to her delusions." Ryan turned from the window. "No. If we're going to do this, we do it properly. No more half measures, no more games. She wants to destroy the Kellerman name? Then she dies knowing exactly why and who ordered it." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. His son was proposing something that went beyond business necessity into personal vengeance. "Ryan, there are practical considerations." "Fuck practical considerations," Ryan interrupted, his voice carrying a rage that Thomas had never heard from him. "She put me through hell for 7 years. She made me fake my own death, live in hiding, watch my father slowly deteriorate from poison. She turned my childhood into a lie and my family into a war zone." Thomas realized that his son's coldness had been masking something deeper, a fury that had been building for 7 years, waiting for the right moment to express itself. "She wants 24 hours? Ryan continued. "Fine. Let's give her 24 hours to remember exactly what she chose when she betrayed this family." That night, Thomas and Ryan visited Diana together for the first time since the conspiracy's discovery. They found her in her room, no longer pretending to be medicated, looking every inch the aristocratic woman she'd once been. "I wasn't expecting both of you," Diana said, though her voice betrayed no surprise. "Mother," Ryan said, the word dripping with contempt. "Or should I call you Diana? I'm not sure you've earned the title of mother." Diana's composure flickered for the first time. Seeing her son alive and well, but radiating hatred toward her, seemed to shake her more than Thomas's threats ever had. "Ryan, you have to understand." "I understand perfectly," Ryan interrupted. "You chose money and a lover over your family. You tried to murder my father and traumatize me for life. You turned me into a ghost for 7 years while you played the grieving mother." Thomas watched the reunion with fascination. This was the confrontation that had been building since the night Ryan first revealed the conspiracy. Mother and son, facing each other across an unbridgeable chasm of betrayal and revenge. "I never wanted you to be hurt," Diana said, tears beginning to form. "Everything I did was to secure our future." "Our future?" Ryan laughed, and the sound was devoid of any warmth. "You mean your future with Morrison? I was just collateral damage in your great romance." Diana reached toward her son, but Ryan stepped back as if her touch would contaminate him. "You want to know what you accomplished, Mother?" Ryan continued. "You created this." He gestured to himself and Thomas. "You turned us into something harder and colder than you ever imagined. You taught us that family loyalty is conditional and that betrayal has to be punished completely." Thomas saw Diana finally understand the magnitude of what she'd created. Her son wasn't just angry. He was transformed, weaponized by her betrayal into something that could destroy her without hesitation. "Ryan, please, I'm your mother." "No," Ryan said with absolute finality. "You stopped being my mother the day you chose to poison my father. You're just an enemy who used to live in our house." Thomas stepped forward, taking control of the conversation. "Diana, you have one chance to minimize the damage. Tell us who else knows about your plan. Give us copies of all your recordings, and we'll make your death quick." Diana stared at both men, her husband and her son, and finally understood that there would be no negotiation, no mercy, no escape. The game she'd been playing for 7 years was over, and she'd lost. "You're both monsters," she whispered. "Yes," Thomas agreed. "We are. Because monsters are what you created when you tried to destroy our family." Ryan pulled out a syringe filled with clear liquid, something Victor's people had provided. "This will feel like a heart attack. Quick, relatively painless. More mercy than you showed us." Diana's eyes widened as she realized this was actually happening. "Wait, please, I can give you everything. The recordings, the contacts, all of it. We can make a deal." "The time for deals was 7 years ago," Thomas said, "when you chose betrayal over loyalty." Ryan moved toward his mother with the syringe, his face showing no emotion. Diana pressed herself against the wall, finally understanding that her son had moved beyond her reach forever. "I love you," she whispered desperately. "You're my son. I love you." "Then you should have thought of that," Ryan said quietly, "before you tried to destroy everything I cared about." The injection was quick and professional. Diana's body convulsed briefly, then went still. Thomas and Ryan stood over her corpse, two men who had been forged by betrayal into something that could kill without hesitation or regret. "It's finished," Thomas said. Ryan nodded, already thinking ahead to damage control and cleanup. "Victor's people will handle the scene. By morning, it'll look like she finally succumbed to her mental illness." As they left the facility, Thomas realized that his son had passed the final test of Kellerman loyalty. Ryan had killed his own mother to protect the family name, proving that blood meant nothing compared to the bonds forged by shared struggle and absolute trust. The dynasty was secure. The Kellerman name would endure, carried forward by a man who understood that mercy was weakness and that betrayal could never be forgiven or forgotten. Thomas looked at his son and felt the cold satisfaction of complete victory. They had faced the ultimate test of family loyalty and emerged stronger than ever. The empire they'd built would last for generations, protected by men who would do anything, sacrifice anyone, to preserve what they'd created together. In the end, Diana had been right about one thing. Thomas and Ryan had become monsters. But they were monsters who would never betray each other, and in Thomas's world, that was the only form of family that mattered. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.